Part 1, The Being. Moralism. As children grow up, they learn to abstract, generalize, and evaluate. They become emotionally attached to the summations and assessments they make in the course of learning how to make them. They learn to predict and control future events by remembering episodes that were painful and avoiding such episodes in the future. They remember episodes that were pleasant and try to recreate them. Life becomes a story, and the job is to remember the episodes, figure out the moral to the story, and use the instruction to live wisely and not get hurt or look like a fool. Growing up, children eventually get to the point where they can't stop living in their stories, and they continue, like compulsive gamblers, until they are finally exhausted or out of resources. This is moralism, a disease from which we all suffer. It is incurable. It can only be managed and lived with like herpes or diabetes. Most people believe that morals are good and children should be given moral instruction. Most people raise their children to live in the jail of moralism in which they themselves live. Most teachers consider their main function to be teaching children to behave and do right and be conscientious. Every adult has a whole raft of values they think should be taught to children. Few of these people are conscious of the way in which the children are taught to value the values. Schools are central agents for transmission of the disease of moralism. The disease of moralism in adults is characterized by hysterical faith in the mind. We are all sick to death from moralism. The world of human beings may die from it. The passing on of learning from one generation to the next is not a bad design, and as an evolutionary development, it seems to have triumphed. The idea-generating, self-perpetuating machine that has evolved seems to have worked. Human beings have taken over the world. The ability to act based on accumulated information and to pass great quantities of new information on is the primary survival characteristic of the strongest animal on Earth. But, paradoxically, our survival mechanism has proved to be ultimately suicidal. It has allowed us to mass produce the consumables that provide us with the comfortable lifestyles that eventually kill us, to develop a technology for mass destruction of humans and the natural environment, and to rationalize the inexorable destruction of millions of lives relegated to fates of poverty, disease, and violence. Now we have to fix a few of our own glitches, perhaps in just a decade or two, or risk dying of our own evolution. Otherwise, human history may become just a little blip in time, at the end of which technical design ability surpassed psycho-emotional evolution, eventually extinguishing the species. Gregory Bateson says, in his calm, detached way, any species can get into an evolutionary cul-de-sac, and I suppose it is a mistake of sorts for that species to be a party to its own extinction. The human species, as we all know, may extinguish itself any day now. We have arrived at the evolutionary crisis of moralism. Our chances of living beyond this crisis of consciousness are, of course, unknown. Probably the odds are in favor of extermination of either the species or the world that provides the context in which it lives, or both. Managing the disease of moralism. Adult moralists are always angry people. The more the moralist is confronted with sloppy old experience, the more hysterical he or she becomes. We all get hysterical, but some of us lighten up and come to our senses more often than others. Some of us operate from hysterical moralism most of the time. Famous political moralists like Joseph McCarthy, Spiro Agnew, J. Edgar Hoover, Hitler, and John Ashcroft are great prototypes of the disease in our culture. More lawyers have come to me for therapy than have members of any other profession, and it's not coincidence, since so much of their training is to learn to live by rules. One important rule they try to live by is that the proper way to be angry is to have a fight using the rules. They often try to do this in their private lives with complete lack of success. Perpetual arguing to convince others of the rightness of your case doesn't work worth a damn in personal relationships, and we all know it, but can't seem to stop. A law school education emphasizes the idiocy already built in by the culture. Law school begins with memorizing tort, formally learning the case from the past and the principles they represent. And it gets worse as it goes on. After 3 years of law school, a graduate usually takes the next step toward a law career. The bar exam for which he or she has to take a cram course to memorize cases, principles, generalizations, and values. When the exam is administered, the potential member of the bar knows in advance that he or she must score in the upper 50% of those taking the exam or fail. In the District of Columbia, if you are in the lower half of the group but close to the cutoff, you may appeal your grade and request that your paper be regraded. However, they will not tell you the new grade until after the next bar exam has been administered. If you want to be sure you can go to work as a lawyer, you had better take the exam again, even though you may have passed already. This is to teach you a lesson. Do what you're told, no matter how ridiculous or unfair, if you want to be a lawyer. This continues year after year, with the only apparent purpose being to make sure you have really learned to kiss ass in the culturally approved way. Having passed the bar, if you are a high achiever, you then typically do a 3 to 7 year stint of working 70 to 80 hours a week for a law firm trying to make partner. After you have proven, through many additional trials, that you have learned to kiss ass in all circumstances, you may make partner. By the time you make partner, you are a workaholic, so you keep up the pace out of habit, but also because you don't know what in the hell else to do in life but work and count principles. This is the group from which we choose our political representatives. This is where judges come from. Though the learned disease of moralism is rampant in all professions, the middle-aged lawyer is the quintessential prototype for this disease. Lawyers are the best representatives of the way people are today. They are the mind of our culture. One of the things that helps this disease of moral hysteria to progress is detachment from identification of ourselves as our experience. Hard physical work for the sake of survival used to keep more people in touch with the world of being. As life becomes less toil and more thinking and problem solving, there is less opportunity to have one's attention called forth from the mind by more immediate demands of survival on a day-to-day basis. The gap created by lack of grounding in our experience leaves us dependent on ideas, principles, rules, values, and imagination as our primary modes of orientation. These ideas and values are tightly held in the same way an adolescent grasps onto roles when he joins a gang or becomes a Christian or Hare Krishna or falls in love and gets married in high school. Without roles and rules, we fear we will lose control of ourselves. We will go crazy. We will lose our minds. The more intensely these rules and roles are defended, the further removed from grounding in experience the individual becomes. After enough practice at role-playing and idealism, our whole way of orienting ourselves in the world depends on principles of orientation, rather than on the ability to respond as needed based on what we perceive. This moralism, this web of entrapment of human aliveness, is a crippling disease. We all have it. It is terminal. It cannot be cured. It's a hell of a lot worse than herpes. It is as deadly as AIDS. It is in our schools. It is in our minds. It is in the bloodstream of our culture. It is in this book. Sometimes I receive letters from people who have heard that I am an expert in stress management. They ask me to suggest what they can do about stress and various psychosomatic disorders. They want recommendations about how to behave and what to do. I know when I write back that whatever I tell them probably won't work. Whatever advice I give them will be used as another principle to beat themselves over the head with, which is what caused the problem in the first place. Moralists who read about ways to beat stress only make those ways into new rules with which to oppress themselves. People who try to take a shit at 7 a.m. precisely every day, whether they need to or not, are different from people who take a shit when they feel like they need to. J. Edgar Hoover died of apoplexy. Maybe he popped a blood vessel in righteous indignation. I like to imagine he was reading a book on stress management at the time. Field independence versus field dependence. A number of experiments in the past 30 years have been designed to study what psychologists called field dependence and field independence. Imagine this scene. A person is seated in a darkened room. 10 feet in front of this person stands another person holding a luminescent square frame surrounding a luminescent straight rod. The room is darkened. All the subject can see is the frame and the rod. Both the frame and the rod are mounted on an axle, so they may each be rotated in both directions. The person holding the frame and rod rotates both at random for a while. The frame is stopped and the rod continues moving for a while. The person holding the rod and frame then says to the subject, "Tell me when the rod is straight up and down, the same as the walls outside." Some people will make the rod straight up and down by using the square as a frame of reference. These people are called field dependent because they depend on the context or field provided by the frame to judge when the rod is perpendicular. Other people line the rod straight up and down with regard to their own bodies. These people are called field independent because they operate independent of the square as a frame of reference. Another variation of this experiment has the subject strapped into a tilting chair inside the room that tilts. Motors tilt both the room and the chair and stop at some point at random. The subject is instructed to give verbal instructions to the operator of the motor that moves the chair to make himself line up straight. Field-dependent subjects will tolerate up to a 33-degree angle of tilt and will say they are aligned with the walls outside as long as they are tilted in the same direction as the room. Like those who depend on the frame to judge the angle of the rod, these field-dependent people depend on the tilt of the room to adjust the tilt of the chair in which they sit, even though their own bodies are telling them they are not sitting upright. There is further research that demonstrates that field dependence is correlated with social dependence. Field-dependent, socially dependent people take their cues from external frames of reference. Field independence is correlated with social independence and with creativity. Artists tend to be field independent. Those who learn to depend on rules rather than the seats of their pants, like lawyers, tend to be field dependent. Catholic parochial school is an excellent method for the accomplishment of field dependence. Parochial school students, like law students, make better sheep than people. Catholic education and law schools provide me with a lot of miserable people as psychotherapy clients. I should be grateful. These people are looking for rescue from their education. The problem is they all want me to tell them what to do so they can try hard to do it, be better than anyone else at it, and get good grades so God will love them. Depending on an external frame of reference for social orientation leads you to try to manipulate other people to get what you want rather than getting it on your own. What the well-trained, field-dependent client usually does is try to con the therapist into telling him to do what he already wants to do, but is afraid of failing and getting blamed for. So if he fails, he can blame the authority who told him to do it. Fritz Perls said in 1946, "Principles are substitutes for an independent outlook. The owner would be lost in the ocean of events if he were not able to orient himself by these fixed bearings. Usually he is even proud of them and does not regard them as weaknesses, but as a source of strength. He hangs on to them because of the insufficiency of his own independent judgment." We are all afraid to give up our moralism. We are afraid that if we do, we will go out of control. We might do something bad or bizarre or crazy. We might go out of our minds. Erik Erikson, in the biography Young Man Luther, speculates that someday, maybe, there will exist a well-informed, well-considered, and yet fervent public conviction that the most deadly of all possible sins is the mutilation of a child's spirit. For such mutilation undercuts the life principle of trust, without which every human act, may it feel ever so good and seem ever so right, is prone to perversion by destructive forms of conscientiousness. When we take innocent and open children and train them to be moralists, we train them at one and the same time to be liars. Moralism and lying go hand in hand. Being good and looking good, conscientiously valued, lead directly to lying. If you can fool the nuns into believing you are good like they want you to be, you can secretly do what you want. Moral instruction, stringently imposed, tears children loose from their grounding in experience, from their trust of the world based on just being here, and makes them into conscientious, suffering torturers of the next generation. In Erikson's words, "The child forced out of fear to pretend that he is better when seen than when unseen is left to anticipate the day when he will have the brute power to make others more moral than he ever intends to be himself." The death grip with which one holds on to principles is a source of unhappiness and anger. We can make a moral resolve that people should let up on themselves and other people, but that is just more impotent moralism. If moralism is as common and influential in our society as I have described, how might one use the disease? That is, instead of attempting to cure it, how could we manage it and deal creatively with its use? Managing the disease of moralism is done by telling the truth, like children do before they lose their innocence. I have this disease. I want to use it rather than be used by it. How can I not just manage my critical self-judgment, mean to those closest to me self, but use it to be happy, productive, and alive? My clients and friends and I have been having success in managing moralism by telling the truth. The scary thing is that no one else can predict what will happen to you if you attempt to let up on your moralism. Only you can discover that by abandoning the protection of your moralism in some way. Taking that risk is moving toward independence. Self-reliance is field independence. Moral hysteria is field dependence. In the work I do, the most interesting questions are: can someone who has learned to be field dependent and socially dependent learn independence? Can moralism be transformed from a life-threatening disease to a managed one? The answer to both questions is yes, if the person is willing to tell the truth.